All right, welcome everybody. We'll take a few minutes to get settled in. If you haven't done so already, please use the chat feature to share where you're joining us from. We like to kind of see where in the world our audience is joining from. Let's see, New York City and Chicago, Pennsylvania. Earlier, I saw Mount Dora, Florida. I have a good friend who used to live in Mount Dora, Florida. And that's exciting. There's a Jane Austen festival there. That's excellent. Let's see, Columbia, Missouri, Southern California, Carborough, North Carolina, Sevilla, Spain, Hertfordshire, England, Lindsay, Ontario. Welcome in. It is so good to be with you all once again. We hope you've been enjoying our Austen and Brontë series, and we're excited to continue it today at a new, unique starting time to accommodate our UK presenters. All right, Laura Rockland is joining from Boston. Shout out to Laura who just presented just the other week. Thanks for joining today. Okay, we will go ahead and get started. My name is Eric Bontempo. I am one of the co-directors of Jane Austen and Company, and also a co-director of the Jane Austen Summer Program. I am joined tonight by Susan Allen Ford, Deb Barnum, and our technical director, Nadea Pugh. And we also have some esteemed guests here as well, and we'll introduce them momentarily. At Jane Austen and Company, we are here to spotlight Jane Austen and women's literary traditions more generally. And we are so excited that in this series, we are getting to read and think about the Brontë sisters in relation to Jane Austen.
So at the outset of today's program, we'd like to thank the North Carolina Humanities for their generous support. North Carolina Humanities is a statewide nonprofit affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which connects North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. Their funding has played a significant role in making this series possible, so we thank them.
This is the final event in our Austen and the Brontë series. That is until we return in the fall later this year. We're excited to announce that we're going to continue the Austen and the Brontë series with a brand new lineup of speakers. So stay tuned for future updates. Many of you already subscribe to our newsletter, but if you aren't signed up, we highly recommend it. Visit our website, janeaustenandco.org, to subscribe.
And on behalf of myself, David Palco, Susan, Deb, Nadea, and Inga Brody, we want to thank you all for supporting this new series. We've had a blast the past 2 months putting on and facilitating 4, soon to be 5 fantastic events with incredible speakers. We've had Diana Birchall and Siri James perform their play, You Are Passionate, Jane, back in March, I believe. We had so much fun with Leslie Peterson in April as she guided us through a creative writing workshop, learning to rant and rave in the style of Jane Austen and Emily and Charlotte Brontë. Talia Schaffer's scholarly presentation on communities of care in Persuasion and Jane Eyre generated some really thought-provoking Q&A amongst attendees. And then just the other day, we had actor and playwright Laura Rockland join us to discuss her experiences adapting Austen and the Brontës, and to perform some of the winning essays that were submitted to our essay writing contest. We've had a busy but oh so fun spring with you all. If you missed any of those events, you can watch them anytime on our website or from our YouTube channel. Like I said earlier, our primary mission with this public humanities initiative is to create high quality, accessible content that spotlights the life and impacts of Jane Austen. We look forward to continuing to bring you content later this year and hopefully in years to come. And for that to remain possible, we welcome any and all donations. So while we're on hiatus this summer, we hope you will continue to support Jane Austen and Company through your donations and through sharing our contents with your friends and social networks. And now Susan and Deb will introduce today's two speakers.
So Lizzie Dunford has been the director, say hi, Lizzie, has been the director of Jane Austen's House since 2020. She's an expert on the management, marketing, and interpretation of writers' houses, with over 15 years experience in the heritage and tourism sector. Her 2023 JASNA AGM paper, Darling Children, The Presence of Pride and Prejudice in Jane Austen's House, was published in Persuasions Online. It's volume 44, number 1, and it's available to all. It's really worth reading because you find out about an Elizabeth Bennet, a witch. So she regularly presents and writes on Austen, museum practice, and literary homes. And we who attend the JASNA AGMs have been thrilled to have her visit us these past few years. And she will be again in Cleveland.
Great. Anne Dinsdale is principal curator at the Brontë Parsonage Museum in Haworth, where she works on organizing exhibitions and caring for the collections. She's a contributor to the Brontes in Context and a companion to the Brontes, and the author of At Home with the Brontes, The History of Haworth Parsonage and Its Occupants. Before Lizzie and Anne take the stage, I'm going to turn this over to Nadia, who has some further instructions for us.
Thank you so much, Susan. Hi, everybody. Welcome to YouTube, our streaming platform. If you'd like to leave a comment or ask a question, please use the comment feature on the sidebar, and we'll be keeping an eye on the comments there throughout our presenters' presentation. If they can, Anne and Lizzie will respond to the comments as they go, but otherwise we'll just pose those questions during the Q&A after the presentations. To post in that sidebar, you will need to log into your Google or YouTube account, but if you don't have a YouTube or Google account, that's okay as well. And you can just submit your questions to us via our email, which is info@janeaustenandco.org. We'll collect questions and comments there as well and ask them for you in the chat. And our speakers really love hearing from their audience, so please, please, please share your thoughts.
Thank you, Nadia. And now, without further ado, here are Anne and Lizzie. We're going to have Anne get started with her short presentation, then Lizzie will take over, and from there we'll launch into our discussion. And as Nadia said, we are counting on all of you to keep your questions coming. So, to you.
Okay. The parsonage at Haworth, set on the edge of the Yorkshire moors, is the house where the Brontes lived for most of their lives and wrote some of the most famous novels in English literature. It exudes a sense of place from every angle. There is the first view of the parsonage overlooking the churchyard as you walk up the cobbled street past the church and the Sunday school where Charlotte Brontë once taught. Then in the distance, the moorland landscape. Once inside the house, the Brontë story comes to life in every room. There is the dining table at which Charlotte, Emily and Anne sat to write, the piano played by Emily, the bonnet Charlotte wore for her wedding, the tiny manuscripts the sisters wrote with their brother Branwell as children, and so much more. Haworth Parsonage was occupied by the Brontë family from 1820 to 1861, during which time Patrick Brontë held the position of perpetual curate at Haworth Church, and the parsonage and its surroundings became central to his children's creative lives. For anybody who's not seen the parsonage, this is an image that was probably taken in the late 1850s, showing the house very much as it would have looked when the family lived there. The house is set above the village of Haworth and separated from it by the church, the churchyard, and a square plot of garden, which in the Brontes' time was given over to rough grass and a few stunted bushes. Can I have the next image, please? The front door leads into the flagged entrance hall. The room to the right of the hall was Mr. Bronte's study, sparsely furnished but housing his well-thumbed library. Mr. Brontë himself had published collections of both poetry and prose, and although it's not great literature, his children grew up accustomed to books carrying their family name on the parsonage shelves. The study walls were covered in framed engravings of works by John Martin, fantastic apocalyptic visions which stirred his children's imaginations. Can I have the next image, please? Across the hall is the dining room, where the sisters did much of their writing. Every evening, they would walk around the dining room table, reading aloud from their work and discussing their stories. And it was this close collaborative partnership which Charlotte missed so much after the deaths of her sisters. The kitchen at the parsonage is much altered since the Brontes' time, but it was the warm heart of the parsonage and where the Bronte children would gather round the fire before bedtime to listen to their servant Tabby's local gossip and dark tales of the Yorkshire moors, rich source material for budding young writers. The sisters were expected to take their share of the household tasks, and in later years, Emily acted as housekeeper, spending much of her time scribbling poetry as she kneaded bread dough or waited for a cake to come out of the oven. Working in the kitchen allowed Emily the mental freedom to focus on her writing, and she was to apply domestic detail to great effect in her novel, Wuthering Heights. All three sisters spent time working away from Haworth as governesses or teachers, but home was where their creative lives flourished, in one another's company, with the inspirational moorland landscape surrounding them. Can I have the next image, please? Mrs. Brontë had died within 18 months of the family's arrival at Haworth. And after the first disastrous experience of formal learning, which resulted in the deaths of his two eldest daughters, Mr. Brontë kept his children at home and taught them himself. The girls sat in on their brother's lessons in the classics, and their father encouraged them to read widely. It was a rich and unconventional education. Outside lesson time, Charlotte, Branwell, Emily and Anne created their own imaginary world, inspired by a set of toy soldiers their father bought them. And from acting out stories and plays, they began creating miniature books and magazines, usually no bigger than a matchbox, hand-stitched into covers made from scraps of wallpaper or even old sugar bags. The books contained contents pages and were intended to resemble printed magazines, such as Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, which was read avidly by the Brontë family. Their proportionately tiny script makes them difficult to read without the aid of a magnifying glass. But as well as enabling the children to cram thousands of words into a few tiny pages, it acted as a deterrent to the prying eyes of the parsonage adults, who clearly wouldn't have been able to read any of this tiny writing. Emily rarely left home, and the themes of her adult writing carry on seamlessly from those of her youth. Although her siblings made attempts to break away from their fantasy world with varying degrees of success, these worlds stayed with them into adulthood and continued into the published novels of all three sisters. The novelist Elizabeth Gaskell, who produced the first of many Bronte biographies, her best-selling book, The Life of Charlotte Bronte, which was published in 1857, just 2 years after the deaths of its subject. And with so much early interest in the Brontes, I think it was inevitable that Haworth and the Brontes' parsonage home became a destination for literary pilgrimage. And also, Gaskell's biography created a market for relics of the famous family. The Reverend Patrick Bronte, who outlived his wife and all 6 of his children, would often receive admirers of his daughter's works at the parsonage. And he would also cut Charlotte's letters into snippets to satisfy requests for samples of her handwriting. The Bronte Society was formed in 1893 by a small group dedicated to promoting the Brontes' works and establishing a museum, an objective they achieved less than 2 years later. In May 1895, the Bronte Society's first museum opened above the Yorkshire Penny Bank at the top of Haworth's steep main street. By 1927, the Society's collection had outgrown the small museum, and at this point, the church trustees announced they would be prepared to sell Haworth Parsonage. Sir James Roberts, a local boy made good, stepped in and not only purchased the parsonage, he also contributed a further sum required to fit the house up as a museum and research library. Can I have the next image, please? On the 4th of August 1928, thousands of people thronged the streets of Haworth to witness Sir James hand over the title deeds to the Bronte Society and be present for the official opening of the Bronte Parsonage Museum. The works of all 3 sisters and the stories of their lives have been absorbed into popular culture worldwide and inspired numerous books, paintings, illustrations, film, radio and TV adaptations, musicals, operas and ballets. The immense popularity of the Brontes, the stories they created and their own life histories has never died. This is the subject of the Bronte Parsonage Museum, which allows us access to the Brontes not only as great writers, but also as ordinary human beings. As Virginia Woolf wrote of her visit in 1904, it is the personal relics, the dresses and shoes that are so profoundly moving. The natural fate of such things is to die before the body that wore them. And because these trifling and transient though they are, have survived, Charlotte Bronte, the woman, comes to life, and one forgets the chiefly memorable fact that she was a great writer. Thank you.
That was magnificent, Anne. Thank you. And thank you everyone for having us and Jane Austen's House as part of the summer programme. I've been really looking forward to this. And one of the great joys has been that it's actually forced me, and through pleasure, to go back and reread the Brontes for the first time in a long time. And also, to my shame, reading Juliet Barker's masterful biography for the first time, which is actually genuinely about 4 inches thick. So I'm not quite all the way through of it yet, but it's been wonderful to return and to look at those differences and to think about them, and also that difference in time between them. So the image that you see here is of Jane Austen's house, actually probably in the Edwardian era. Or a little bit later there are cars, but I've been thinking a lot about the 1840s, and of course Jane Eyre was being published 30 years after Austen died. And they are different eras, and they are really interesting. And this is to get ahead of the discussion, but to start the introduction of Jane Austen's House, I'm actually going to start in 1847. In 1847, Austen had been dead for 30 years, and her sister Cassandra for 2. The house that they had known and that had proven to be a place of such extraordinary creativity had become, instead of the rather elegant and spacious home of the local gentry, cramped tenements for estate workers, although they were still luxurious compared to some of the accommodation in Haworth. And this is how we see the house at the time. It was subdivided, altered, and at the beginning of a long decline into neglect. As Jane Eyre was being published, Jane Austen's house was undergoing a dramatic transformation. I can have the next slide, please. But when Austen, her sister Cassandra, their mother and their sister-in-law Martha and Lloyd moved into the house in 1809, it was a spacious and comfortable residence, as well as a refuge after 8 years of housing insecurity, but never quite homelessness. It was newly decorated, with new windows added and old ones taken away, whilst there were several acres of gardens and meadows to plant and tend and make productive with fruit and vegetables and poultry. Austen lived in a micro-matriarchy, an all-female household that shared domestic tasks amongst themselves. They did receive financial assistance from male relatives, but the household also had its own income. And in terms of movement, decision-making, and thought, they were largely independent and autonomous. For the three younger women, Jane, Cassandra, and Martha, this appears to be a conscious choice rather than a sad tale of being left on the shelf. When they moved into the house, which was already 300 years old by the time of 1809, it appears that the household tasks were divided up between them. Mrs. Austen, quite fairly, after having 8 children, moving a lot, and then on the verge of getting towards 30 grandchildren, hung up her metaphorical chatelaine and instead focused on tending the garden and scandalising her more proper grandchildren by digging potatoes in view of the main road in a labourer's smock. Martha and Cassandra took on the bulk of the housekeeping between them, supervising the cook, directing the housemaids and the manservant, ordering food and supplies, paying the washerwomen, and genuinely ensuring that things ran like clockwork. Next slide, please. And where was Jane in all of this? Well, rather charmingly, her task was to make breakfast, although it is highly unlikely that she either lit or laid the fire it was cooked over, and certainly wouldn't have baked the bed herself. She also ordered the wine and the tea, so a woman very much after my own heart. These arrangements seem to have been designed to free Austen to write, to be a true creative rather than a domestic creature. Next slide, please, with this one. Very occasionally during the Chawton years, both Cassandra and Martha would be away at the same time, and Austen would have to shoulder the burden of housekeeping. We see this vividly in July 1816, as she was working on the concluding chapters of Persuasion. Whilst they were away, she wrote one version of the Anne Elliot Captain Wentworth de Neumont and concluded the novel with a flourish and a finis. She also wrote to Cassandra that she could not think of composition when her head was full of joints of mushroom. The domestic was an unwanted and unwelcome intrusion into her creative, imaginative world. She might have written from the dining room, but she had little interest in providing for it. Next slide, please. Luckily, Cassandra returned from her adventures. Austen returned to her manuscript, and the result was the astonishing, brilliant scene at the White Hart Inn. These brief forays into housekeeping and making breakfast and ordering the wine, along with visits to her father's parishioners in early life and later dollaring out charity money to Edward Austen Knight's tenants, alongside the odd bit of childcare, were as close as Austen got to what we might call work outside of her literary career. She and her sister lived a life of comparative privilege and ease, which meant that threats of becoming a governess or setting up a school or becoming a lady's companion never appeared to have seriously raised their heads. There were worries about money, certainly, especially when her brother Henry's bank collapsed spectacularly, taking tens of thousands of pounds of Austen, Knight and Leaper money with it. And they were, without doubt, the poorer relations of men who saw vast amounts of money pass through their hands every year. But the £110 Austen was paid for Pride and Prejudice in 1813 was 5 times the amount that Charlotte Brontë was earning 30 years later as a governess. And the life lived at Chawton Cottage was comfortable, cosseted even, and allowed for the full expression of Austen's creativity. And over the years she spent here, all of her novels that are published that we read today came into their final form. Next slide, please. It saw her revise and write these novels, and also became a place of learning in its own right, as she used her own teenage writings to teach her eldest nieces and nephews how to create their own novels and their own work. The house, set in Hampshire's gentle pastoral landscape of chalk hills and beechwoods, and surrounded by thatched cottages and Tudor mansions, remains a site of inspiration and pilgrimage down to the present day. And this year, 2024, marks 75 years of the house being open to the public as a museum. Thank you.
All right. Thank you both so much for those wonderful presentations. If you're in the audience, please submit your questions. We would love to feature your question and ask them to Anne and Lizzie. And so we have plenty of time for moderated discussion now. And I thought a good place, maybe for me, in my own curiosity, because I've never visited either one of these locations, is just if you both could help to situate me and the audience a little bit geographically. How far apart are the Brontë Parsonage and Jane Austen's house in terms of miles? Or maybe it should be kilometers.
No, we're UK, we're miles.
Yeah. I'm not sure.
Hundreds and hundreds of miles. I will look it up while we're talking, but a very long way.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So hundreds of miles, not an easy trip to make. You can't see both houses in the same day, I assume.
No.
It's not a quick train ride.
No.
Very good. Okay, and so I assume, are the climates in these two parts of England very different as well?
Well, West Yorkshire, where the parsonage is pretty well known for its wild, wuthering weather. I imagine there's not a huge difference, but I think we probably get more snow and that it's slightly colder.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, so they're really almost opposite ends of the country to some extent. So we're only about 30 miles from the very south coast of the UK, and the landscapes are fundamentally different. Very, very different. So what you see in the Bronte's novels is phenomenally what you get when you visit Haworth. Austen obviously doesn't describe landscape in any way, and she certainly doesn't describe her native landscape. But they are the Hampshire landscape is softer. It's definitely literally smoothed out. There are no crags and moorlands around here. Much to our shame, it would be a far more romantic place if it was. And we have different agricultural practices, and the fundamental, also slightly superficial difference as well, is there's a different aspect of industry, particularly in the times when the two authors were writing. And I know you'll know more. You know, the Haworth is a much more industrial.
Absolutely. In Haworth, at the time that the Brontes were there, I think a third of the population were employed in the textile industry. It's quite a gritty place with grey stone houses perched on the side of a steep hillside, with a bit of subsistence farming. But yeah, quite a wild and quite a bleak place.
We have a comment from an audience member. The Brontes write of stormy weather, yet Jane Austen doesn't very much, as I remember, a result of their locations. Perhaps so. Maybe not.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, actually, because I think people always associate the Brontes with stormy, wild weather. But we actually did a contemporary art project called the Weather Project a few years ago. And we worked with an artist who produced sort of like pie charts looking at the three main novels. And she recorded references to different types of weather. So it's interesting that actually there's a lot more sunshine in the Brontë novels than people realise.
And there's quite a bit of rain in Austen.
Yeah, well, that's true too. Just bringing my own experience in here for a moment. I visited Haworth about, 12 years ago or 15 on a March day, and it snowed and it rained and I got a sunburn. all during the course of that one day. So changeable seems to be the word.
British weather. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question. What in each of your houses seems to affect, move, or surprise visitors the most? And do you have any great stories that you can tell?
We've got, in the museum collection at the parsonage, we've got over 8,000 items that either were directly owned by the Brontes or are connected with them in some way. I think the most moving objects to people are the little books, which I showed an image earlier. Their tiny scale is just extraordinary. And they've got all those kind of details that you would expect to see in published magazines. Some of them have even got advertisements in the back. We have the writing desks that the sisters used, the table that I mentioned where they would write, and they would walk around the table every evening discussing their writing. So these are things that have got kind of an iconic sort of status.
I remember that. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm going to say we also have the sofa on which Emily died.
I remember being surprised to see any of Charlotte's clothing, how tiny she was. I think that's a surprise to see. So Lizzie, what about the Jane Austen House?
I think for us, actually, in many ways, it's being in the space, and we don't have, sadly, the Austen relics. There aren't as many as the Bronte, and we don't have. The little books are just unequaled in their. They're just astonishing, I think, in their power to move. And this is but I was very privileged. There was an amazing collection of the Honresfield items, which included a lot of Bronte thing, and I was very lucky to be at the auction house at the same time as you and Rebecca were at. I could feel your emotion. I mean, there were 2 Austen letters. It was lovely. I'd read them. They were lovely. It was beautiful. But the emotion of you and Rebecca of being with these incredible objects, many of which have been lost, was just phenomenal. And I will remember that forever.
Likewise, I'll remember the Jane Austen letters. Yeah. And we were actually locked in with them, weren't we?
We were locked in a room with all these treasures that hadn't been seen for 100 years. And it was a really emotive experience. I think for us, actually, a lot of people, it's kind of the minute they walk in through the drawing room, actually. It's not necessarily object led. I think for us, it's often quite space led, because the house isn't always quite what people expect it will be. So I think it's quite interesting. I think because Austen, with the exception obviously of the famous descriptions of Barton Cottage, she doesn't describe interiors, she doesn't describe spaces either in her letters or her novels. So there is a sense of unexpected, and the house sort of, it's still not huge, but it's often bigger and it's a larger space. So the moment where we see an emotive response is actually often the minute of crossing the threshold, actually.
Thanks.
My question is a little bit related to Deb's, and that is, what is it like to work in these homes, maybe in contrast to other literary homes or museums that you've worked in? And does each home seem to have a specific mood or even moods attached to it somehow?
I can't really answer that because I've worked at the parsonage for 35 years. So that's the only literary house I've ever worked in.
What about mood? I mean, do you have a kind of feeling that is associated with working in there or being in there, or does it change from day to day?
There is a mood and an atmosphere in the house. Sometimes you do feel like you get very close to the Brontes. It's hard to define, really. I'm always being asked, "Is the house haunted?" But I've never seen anything. vaguely ghost-like.
I've worked in 2 other writers' houses. One that was only a writer's house briefly and spent most of its time as a very cold, very creepy medieval Tudor house, and that certainly had an atmosphere. It was a writer called Eileen Power, who was very influential in women's history. She wrote work in that particular house. It was called Paycocks. I started my career working at George Bernard Shaw's house, which was where Shaw was a very prolific playwright, and was where Pygmalion, amongst other things, was written. And they did have 2 separate and quite distinct moods, actually, to the 2 houses, partly because Shaw's Corner, George Bernard Shaw's house, that was open to the public within 6 months of Shaw's death, whereas there's 132 years between Austen's burial and the house the JAH opening to the public, and that means their collections are quite different. The way they've been formed is quite different. They still shared that sense of the author having just left, I think, and that sense of space. And I think the houses, they certainly have different moods, I think. And I think it was really interesting. I don't know if you found the same, but in lockdown, these are houses that have been public spaces for actually a very long. A parsonage is a public space actually in its own way. These have not been private dwellings for a very long time, and them actually being shuttered and closed. That started. Did you feel it started to feel a bit strange? Didn't it?
It felt very strange. I'm used to many visitors passing through the parsonage, so it would be just me and 2 other colleagues sometimes in different parts of the building. So it seemed eerily quiet. The grandfather clock on the staircase was stopped. So it's quite a scary time.
And they definitely had. There's a different mood when the house is full of people. It's not a bad mood; it's a good mood. It's like a buzzy and then when you're walking through a building on your own, it's completely different. Like Jane Austen's house isn't haunted. It's the most uncreepy building you can possibly imagine. It's just so warm and well, frequently physically freezing, but welcoming. But it's a very different feeling walking through those spaces. On your own.
I think one of the things about the parsonage as well is that people kind of expect it to be gloomy and dark, and actually it's got a very elegant facade. It catches all the morning sun, so it's not always the kind of spooky dark place that visitors expect.
I want to jump in and share some audience questions with you. I mean, this one I think has been answered, but at this point. But as a follow-up question to Kitty's question, can you actually walk through both houses? Is it a common experience to spend an entire day just in the house or in the parsonage? Like, is it something you can find yourself getting lost in?
No, not that big for us. No. I mean, you're very welcome to, but it would. I think
we do get visitors who spend a lot of time lingering in the rooms, absorbing the atmosphere, but I don't think they manage to string it out for a full day.
I think you'd be hard pushed to ask to spend both days. It's been a full day now.
Well, then here's another follow-up, another question from Kitty. Besides visiting Haworth in particular, what other things in the area would you recommend visiting?
Well, obviously, there's the church where Patrick Brontë was perpetual curate, and the family vault is in the church. So all the members of the Brontë family are buried there, with the exception of Anne, who died and is buried in Scarborough on the Yorkshire coast. Next year, there'll be the Brontë birthplace at Thornton near Bradford, which will be opening after being closed for many years. It's currently being refurbished, but that'll be another wonderful Brontë-related site to visit.
Really excited to come and see that.
Thank you.
Also, if you're up there, not far away is Anne Lister's house at Shibden Hall. which is really worth. And actually, Halifax full stop is quite a fast. The piece, what's it called? The Peace Hall. Peace Hall at Halifax. It's really interesting and and certainly you won't see anything like Halifax or that area down in Austen country. It's very, very different.
And of course, there's the landscape and the moorland.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to, when you're out, you have to do, because I did it when I came, you have to do the walk. There's a walk out in Scotland, and it's just the most emotive, after being around the house to then walk up out to the moors. It's the most incredible experience, actually.
Well, I want to go back to money because I was intrigued by what Lizzie was saying about the differences between the Austen family, the Austen women, and how, although they were in some ways living on the edge and did not have a lot of disposable income, they weren't actually homeless, and they didn't have to go out and governess or be a companion or anything like that. And I mean, I guess I'm used to kind of thinking of the Brontes as living more on that edge. But then when you see that house, and you talked, Anne, about its elegance and the front, and the pictures that you showed of the dining room, for instance, look, you know, to a modern eye, like as if these are people with money. Can you help us understand that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, the parsonage belonged to the church. It came rent-free with Patrick Bronte's position. He was not independently wealthy, and it was always very clear that all his children would have to be in a position to support themselves. He'd come from a poor background in the north of Ireland, and through sheer hard work and ambition, he'd got himself to Cambridge University and established himself as a well-respected Church of England clergyman. But the Brontes, although they were middle class in the sense that they were educated, they were still poor enough to need to earn a living. And the image of the dining room that I showed dates with the style of decor, dates from the 1850 period when Charlotte used some of the money she'd made from her novels to kind of gentrify the house. We were spending time in London, staying with her publisher, visiting Mrs. Gaskell in Manchester. And also, she just recently lost her sisters. And I think the austerity of the parsonage must have made itself felt for the first time. And she did use some of her income to make it more comfortable.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
I've actually just seen another question about the graveyard adjacent to the parsonage. Was there ever any concern about contagion? And that's quite an interesting question. I think people have an idea of the Brontes as being these frail, sickly women, when actually the average life expectancy in Haworth in the 1840s was 25 years. And a health survey carried out showed that of all the children born in Haworth in the 1840s, 41% would die before reaching the age of 6. And a lot of that was to do with the churchyard. If you know Haworth and the geography, all the public wells and pumps were fed by water running off the moors and running through the churchyard. So the fact that the churchyard was so crowded and that the water was running through there means that it was contaminated, and it was largely the reason why the health in Haworth was so poor.
I just wanted to jump in again about the kind of comparative wealth of their family, because whilst they were both vicars, and there is a difference between a vicar and it's a specific term, and it's about how, they were paid effectively and supported by their parishioners. So how wealthy a vicar was actually depended on the wealth of your parish. And this is where you see the difference between them. So whilst Haworth was a much bigger parish than the Reverend George Austen's was, Steventon was much wealthier. So I think an annual, Mr. Brontë was having something like under £200 a year.
It was just under £200 a year.
Whereas sort of 20 years earlier, the Austen household was having £400, £500, £600. And of course, the Austens could also run the school, and they also had a farm. So they were in a slightly different financial position, even as a young woman. The Austen household was able to support a carriage for a while, which is quite a marker of wealth. And in the last year, when they're leaving Steventon in 1801, if you are obsessively reading through Deirdre Lefray's chronology, like some people do, there's over £1,000 passes through the Reverend George Austen's hands in that time. So they are in, whilst they're both parsonage houses, not all parishes, predominantly not all parsonages are often very beautiful, large Georgian houses, or the old parsonages. They all got sold off by the Church of England later. So there's very few modern vicars are still living in them because they cost so. But not all parishes were made equal, and that's a very big. Hampshire was in theory a richer part, not. Well, it's more complicated than that, because they were still very rich merchants, but your parishes would generate more money from us than Haworth. So.
Deb, did you want to ask a question, or is it my turn?
Yeah, you were going to bring up about them presenting before, and when they've done that, and then I had a follow up to that. So you
perfect.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. So my next question is. I learned recently that the two of you have presented together, the two houses of two great women writers. And what occasions do you guys get to present together? And why do you think that is so important to do to kind of foster this kind of collaborative nature between Jane Austen's house and the Brontë Parsonage?
Well, I think the COVID pandemic opened up all kinds of new opportunities. We're not the most technically advanced team at the parsonage, I've got to say, and we were kind of forced to develop more online events. So we do a regular online event called the Brontë Lounge. And then we started reaching out to other literary houses, including the Gaskell House at Manchester, and developing events where we'd have a theme, maybe letter writing. And it's a really good chance for us to all kind of talk about our writers.
So we're also one of the ways we work together is we're both part of a fabulous organisation in the UK called the Literary Houses Association, which brings together not quite all, but a lot of the literary houses that are in the UK. And we're very lucky that we have a lot of them in a relatively small area. And one of the things that is very clear from those writers, it's still dominated by male authors. And actually we wanted to come together. So we work with Elizabeth Gaskell's house, as Brontë Parsonage as well, and Chawton House, and also at Jane Austen's house, we've also done some work with the the M.M. Montgomery Institute and Emily Carr House, because actually women's voices are still phenomenally underrepresented. And actually, when you look at pre-1900, actually Brontë and Austen contribute a lot of the women's words that are in print, and actually working together to celebrate our authors' words, but also then to work to continue to amplify women's voices today is something that I think is really important. We can't ignore both their genius and also their privilege in having their words published, which is quite unusual, well, not very unusual for women of their time. And actually, when you look to the Austen publishes anonymously, the Brontes publish under pseudonyms, so there is still a charge with that. So I love doing our online collaborative where we will bring speakers, and yeah, it was a game changer actually doing those online events, and like the one we still continue to do them.
Yeah, that was one of my questions about the pandemic and how, as horrible as it was, and I mean, a lot of your financial base is from tourism, and that ended. And the fact that you went into Zoom mode, how has that sustained you? Obviously, and now you're continuing, even though you are again open. So that's really helped, obviously.
Yeah. We were very lucky in that we got a lot of grants and a lot of support. A lot of our members set up regular donations, so it was quite heartwarming, to know that we'd got that support, because it was a very frightening time. Our income just dried up overnight, really. And we did find that we got a lot of people purchasing from our online shop, a sudden influx of people wanting to become members of the society. People were kind of supporting us in any way that they could. So that was quite heartwarming.
I'd agree. I think actually it was almost in the darkest days. It was actually the support was overwhelming. Like Anne and the Brontë Parsonage, we had a survival appeal, which I am almost convinced there are people who on this chat who I recognise some names anyway, who I know have donated to other campaigns on different things, and that was phenomenal. Actually, I think there was a moment in June 2020 when we didn't know when we were going to reopen. It felt like everything was very bleak, and actually having that support coming in from all over the world was incredibly moving. And I think it sort of just reinforced why we, without wanting to sound too ridiculous, but why we do what we do. And actually it was that real goal of getting things going. And then, yes, when we had to lock down for the second time, we started doing our online guided tours, which was fantastic. So in many ways, the house was, bizarrely, though it was shuttered, it was more open and more accessible than it had actually ever been during that time period. And I think that was really important, and actually seeing how much access and engagement with the houses and the authors through the houses mattered. And it does matter. It really does matter. Was incredibly motivating. And we wouldn't stop it. We wouldn't stop it now. It's an important part of what we do, actually.
Somebody did ask, I'll put it up there, will there another sale of tiles?
No, because I'm never fixed. Hopefully all the roofs are fixed now. So there's no more tiles to sell. There's no more roofs. So I'm afraid you'll have to wait until the next doing again, which hopefully won't be for 70 years. I mean, at some point we might have to re-roof the learning centre, but the tiles on there are from 2009. So they are probably not quite the same historic interest. So yes, no more roofing projects after this one. Touch wood. This is it. I hope.
Maybe you'll need something else.
Oh, I'm sure we will. I'm sure we'll need something else. So yes, there's always going to be ways to get involved, and as we know, to be a part of the stories. We know that it's something. These houses, they aren't just ours. They're part of it. They are for everyone.
Yeah. I've just spotted one of the questions. Someone's asking about the fact that 2028 marks 100 years of the Brontë Parsonage Museum, and someone's asking, if we'll be doing some special things, and we'll have a lot of events and a special exhibition.
Excellent.
And there'll be lots and lots happening in the UK and in the US. Actually, for Austen's 250th birthday, there's going to be a lot happening. We will be announcing details of our program in July.
Oh.
So
Wonderful.
Watch this.
So here's another question. to what extent do you focus on the writers who inhabited these homes? And to what extent do you focus on the conditions of the world around them? Or are those things pretty inextricable?
We focus and have historically focused on the writers' lives. I think that's starting to, certainly at JAH, that is starting to change. And we are starting to bring in more context. I mean, in fact, I can see that someone asked about the changes that's happened in the past 18 years at Jane Austen's house. Actually, we used to talk as much about her brothers as we did about Austen. And actually, one of the things we have really done over the last couple of years is refocus it as Austen's house, not Austen and her family's house. And yes, they did some really interesting things, but it's a small house, and this was a great woman. And we need to make every bit of space to talk about her work is really precious to us. So there has been a slight nothing's gone. It's just I would describe it as a refocusing. But we do want to talk more and more about the context, partly because the perception of the Regency that actually Austen's novels and adaptations of Austen's novels give is so false to the reality. And I'm sorry, that's a bold statement, but it is. The Regency, one of the things I found fascinating, and through reading the big biography, is these days of mourning that was happening all through the the early years of the 19th century. This is through the war at France, and there's these days of I can't remember but these whole national days that everybody closed to pray for the war, and that you never see that in Austen. That never turns up in either her letters. She's talking about, in the way that the Brontes are, this tiny, tiny, tiny section, really minuscule section of society, but conversely is influenced by the whole of society, and it peers up. And I think is definitely going to be coming in and woven into the house, and it's going to be part of the embroidery of the stories that we tell. It won't be an overlay, but it's just, it's part of the stories that we tell in the house. But at the moment,
I think we as well make a much greater attempt to put the Brontes in context. Sometimes I think it quite surprises people. Back in 2015, we did an exhibition called The Brontes War and Waterloo. And people were kind of saying, well, what have the Brontes got to do with war? But actually, they were very politically engaged. And they'd grown up, through those years of Waterloo. And I think a lot of people perhaps don't realise that Charlotte was obsessed with the Duke of Wellington, and nearly all her early writing is written in the persona of the Duke of Wellington or one of his sons. Usually Branwell favoured Napoleon. Of course, it was like the Beatles and the Stones of its day. But yeah, there are a lot of connections with the wider world and the Brontes, which we've been incorporating into exhibitions. So kind of showing a different side to the family, I think.
Wonderful. I wanted to make sure to get to this audience question, because this is something we've been talking about throughout this series. Question from the audience. I know how much disdain Mark Twain had for Jane Austen, but were all of the Brontes not fond of Jane Austen as well? We had talked at a previous event, a letter that I think Charlotte had written to George Henry Lewes, and she says she's not the biggest fan of Jane Austen, but maybe that's not the whole picture. Do either of you want to respond to this question?
Well, I would just say that if you were a writer and you were being advised to correct your faults in the light of this other great writer, it wouldn't kind of predispose you to like their work. I mean, Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte are very different writers. It has been suggested that Anne Bronte might have read Jane Austen. So it appears Charlotte had never read any Jane Austen until she was advised by Lewis to read some, and she duly went off and read Pride and Prejudice. But it's that you do get a slight feel in Anne Bronte's work that she, particularly in Agnes Grey, that she might have been influenced by Austen.
I love Agnes Grey. I think it's beautiful. I think also there is, I think you're absolutely right, that because Charlotte Bronte is such an aware and considered reader. And in that response to Lewis, there are some things that she misses about Pride and Prejudice, which I think she's reading it angry, because I think if she didn't read it angry, because when she says, where are the bonny becks, where are the hills, where's the outdoors, and go, well, actually, that's all in, very little in Pride and Prejudice actually takes place in drawing rooms. Most of it is outdoors. And I think actually, I think if she'd read it in a different way. I do also have a sneaking suspicion that Mansfield Park might have crossed her radar at some point, but I have no evidence to prove that. Just because of those opening chapters, the tone of Fanny Price's experience and Jane Eyre's experience have a similarity of tone, but that's only a suspicion. And because Austen, she could have picked up a copy of that was anonymous and not known who they could all have read Austen and not known that it was Austen if they were reading pre-named editions. But they're very different writers doing very different things.
I like that headcanon of Fanny Price, Jane Eyre, close literary cousins of sorts. I like that. Thank you for answering those questions. Deb, did you want to chime in, or Susan?
I do have a question about, you brought up exhibitions at your houses, and I know that sometimes that there's some parts of the exhibitions that are available online, but largely you have an exhibition. I know you have one right now at the Parsonage on Bronte, their childhood. Yeah. And you have an exhibit going on right now, Lizzie, that's, what's that specific?
Mansfield Park.
It's about, right, Mansfield Park. And that's why you're likening it to Jane Eyre. And I know that it's prohibitive to create any sort of a printed catalog for these exhibitions. But it's always sad to me that all the work that gets put in, all the research, all the information, that there's not something that could be made available after it closes, even as simple as like a PDF that you could sell for a few pounds. Is that ever done? Again, if it's not an online, exhibition where that's maintained.
So all of our sorry, go on.
No, I'm going to say you go first, Lizzie.
So all of our exhibitions that we put on site, all the panels that you'd see on site are online, they're there in perpetuity, and they have been for the past 4 years. So they're all.
So I figured that was fairly new. Yeah,
we weren't doing a lot of exhibitions in the same way before that, so it's but they're all online, and we have made that commitment that so the text that you see online is the text that you would see in person
if you were in there walking around. Yeah. And what about you,
Anne? We have published exhibition catalogues in the past. We've been quite slow in sort of developing exhibitions online, but we are planning to put the current one online at some point, and that's something that we'll look at doing going forward.
It's just hard for all of us, that we can't be there in any given year to see these changes, and so that's all good to know. Thank you.
We have an interesting question from another one of the audience members. Wait, that's not no, this is actually what I wanted to show. I mean, same person. Yeah, sorry, I'm messing up here. She talks about how play and entertainment fed the early literary activity of both of these families of writers. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you tried to show that, if at all, in each of your houses?
Do you want to go?
I'll go with that one. I think they're fundamentally again. Sorry, I keep saying they're fundamentally different.
Yeah.
The childhood experiences are different, particularly when it comes to those teenage writings. Austen is not working collaboratively with her siblings. She is James, who's the eldest brother, does fancy himself as a bit of a writer, and he does write quite extensively. But he's 10 years older than Austen. So there's not this dialogue. You don't see the partnerships that you do between Charlotte and Branwell and Anne and Emily. And it's not quite play in the same way. It's performance, certainly, and entertainment for Austen. And she's going through a period of apprenticeship and teaching herself to write. She doesn't do what the Brontes are doing. She's not doing what they're doing. She's not creating imaginary worlds, descending into that, and that's not a shared experience. Austen is essentially, she's a satirist. She's a satirist, and even her very earliest writings are satires on the literature that she is reading. So she's almost in dialogue with herself. And she is in dialogue with her siblings and the people who she's dedicating the teenage writings to, but it's not collaborative in the same way. She shares her writing as a performance once it's there's lots of performance going on. It's nowhere the same, I don't think. It's extraordinary what the Brontes are creating at the Parsonage. Just extraordinary.
I've got to say, I much prefer Jane Austen's Juvenile. It's real gloves off stuff. It's
spiky, isn't it? It's spiky.
Yeah. I think because the Brontes were so close in age, and the fact that their mother died when they were so young, Gaskell makes the point that female visitors to the parsonage were few and far between. And the Brontes don't seem to have, Mr. Bronte doesn't seem to have fostered social contacts for his children. So they were kind of thrown in on each other. And it's reported that they didn't actually know the sort of games that ordinary village children were familiar with. So they created their own extraordinary games of the imagination, which kind of really took a hold of them from an early age. So they did collaborate, and they all sparked off each other. They would steal each other's characters, and kind of plots. When Charlotte went away to boarding school, Branwell killed off her favourite character while she was away, and when she came back, she brought her back to life. So they were constantly kind of sparking from each other.
I suppose one thing they do have in common is that kind of play with the idea of publication.
Yes,
as you showed us the image of the title page of the little book, and of course Austen is also setting her things up in terms of volumes with dedications and all, and the kinds of things that would pertain to a published work.
They're thinking of themselves as authors from really early, which I think is important.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, Patrick Bronte was the author of poetry and prose. So the children were familiar with seeing their name in print. And we do know that Mrs. Bronte had actually written an essay with a view to publishing it in some periodical. So, the idea of a woman writing with a view to publication must have been something that they kind of took on board quite early.
Right. I want to get through as many audience questions as I can. We have got about 10-ish more minutes for questions. So keep them coming in if you want. I also wanted to spotlight this link to a virtual stroll through Jane Austen's house. There's the URL on our screen.
All of the exhibitions are linked to that. You'll find all the exhibitions linked through that as well.
Perfect. And in conjunction with that, there was an interesting question that came in a while ago that we haven't had a chance to get to. Lizzie, this is more for you. Kathleen says, I participated in a Jane Austen tour last August and was able to visit Jane Austen's house. It was amazing to sit on the bench where she read Pride and Prejudice to others. Please share about her brother's home to which Jane walked daily.
So there are two things I'd flag with that. That bench is not where Austen sat. We bought that off eBay last year so that you could sit where Austen read it aloud. That is not Austen's bench. That was from eBay. I picked it up from a very big house 10 miles down the road. So that's not Austen's bench. That's part of the experience. But it is where Austen read Pride and Prejudice aloud. She also didn't walk to Chawton House daily. Chawton House is a large Tudor mansion that is just up the road. Her brother Edward owned it. It was part of his inheritance when he came into the Knight money. Edward was actually only there for 3 months out of the time that Austen lived there. It was also tenanted by her brother. Frank was there for 2 years, but it was mostly by other people. So she did go, but we've got records of her visiting about 12, 13 times. But it's a beautiful house run today by an incredible team and has one of the best libraries of women's writing anywhere in the world. They do incredible residencies. So if you're interested, if there are women, writers, particularly from the 17th, 18th and early 19th century that you want to research, Chawton House is the place to go. It's just a phenomenal collection. And also every year, Jasna do an international visitor program, which helps sponsor visits. And Chawton House is often, and that library and that research there is a really strong destination for those researchers. So it's a phenomenal building with 500 years of phenomenal history and some really important women that were involved there. Elizabeth Knight in particular, I would recommend, who is a real powerhouse from the early 18th century. But yeah, it's got a phenomenal history of which Austen is a small part. There's way more going on there. It's a phenomenal place.
And you've been doing more and more collaboration with them. And so like the International Women's Day you did this year.
Yeah, we've always done it with Chawton House. They've always been part of it.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, it's good fun.
There was a, here's one about the Navy, about the context.
So, I think this is, it's also what Anne was talking about. The Napoleonic Wars were huge. Yeah. So they were absolutely, they really dominated. Britain was at war with France for most of Austen's adult life. She and the Brontë, they grew up in the most tumultuous time possible. This, it is comparable to the Second World War, but it lasted for 20 years rather than 5. It disrupted trade. It absorbed people. It caused rampant inflation and deflation. It was incredible. But you're right, she would have known more. She had Charles and Frank that were both in the Navy. They were positioned all over the world. So she was very knowledgeable about what was happening in the world and in that wider context. When she was living in Southampton, which she lived in for 3 years, they were living with Frank's wife and his very young family, and she was living in a port town at a time, a naval base, effectively living in a naval base at a time of war. But I think we tend to, I don't know what you think, Anne, but I think we tend to lose sight now of how important the Napoleonic Wars actually were. You can see people so fascinating to hear you had that response. We go, well, Austen doesn't write about war. It's not part of her novels.
It figures a huge amount of war and warfare in the Brontes' juvenilia. There's always some group fighting another one. It was quite an interesting exhibition that we did in 2015. And in fact, there is a book now written by Emma Butcher, the academic who we worked with on the exhibition. And it's called The Brontes and War. So it's a whole book on that subject.
Well, if you think about Austen's life, England was at war for almost her whole entire life.
It was.
Starting with the American Revolution and then the Peninsular Wars.
Yep.
And then the Napoleon. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all the way through. She's constantly living against a backdrop of warfare, which I think makes Persuasion so more poignant, because it's actually it's written in that moment of peace, and yeah, it's really interesting.
This is a kind of a personal question. What sort of educational background does one need to work in or be head of a literary house?
A lot of luck, I think.
Add that to the question.
I think for me, it was definitely a case of being in the right place at the right time. I'd worked in a library, and I initially started out working in the Parsonage Research Library. I worked with a lot of really first-rate museum curators while I was there. And that just eventually led to me becoming curator at the Parsonage. So my background really is art history, but I have worked at the Parsonage for 35 years now, and I've done a lot of training while I've been there. I think there's a lot of volunteering that you need to do nowadays. It's really difficult to get that experience, and you've usually got to put a lot of time in doing volunteering.
Yeah, I was also, in the right place at the right time. So I studied conservation and restoration of historic objects at university. So I specialised in ceramics and decorative arts. And I was very lucky that when I finished my MA, within 3 months, the National Trust property, which happened to be George Bernard Shaw's house, which was 2 miles down the road, was recruiting for an entry-level job, which was called assistant house steward, which really means glorified cleaner, and lots of slow dusting, which is basically what conservation cleaning is. It's slow and careful dusting with knowing what bugs look like that are trying to eat things. So I was very lucky to get that. If again, it was a case of timing and being geographically in the right place in the right time. And then again, one of the real joys of literary houses, I think, is that by and large, with the exception of Knowle and Newstead Abbey and some of these other places and Knebworth House, they're quite small. And actually that's a real gift for somebody who wants to work and progress in museums, because you always have the idea of these massive edifices. But one of the great joys about literary houses is you're immersed in storytelling, which is actually what museum curation is all about, but you kind of got a head start because you're telling stories about people who told stories. So I was able, by working in really small places, to get quite a breadth of experience of things about, setting up a shop and how to run events and all these different things, which if I'd worked somewhere larger and in just one department, I would never have got. And I think it's a bit, it's hard work. It's work. It is work, but it's fun.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think if you can get experience in a small museum like the Parsonage, all our staff are trained in handling and cleaning museum objects, and they all get time, to work on doing that. So they get all kinds of experience, and I think that stands you in good stead when you go on to another job.
Yeah. Small museums are definitely the way forward for building up experience.
Thank you for that. And a related question that goes hand in hand. Can you talk a little bit about the effort to maintain and upkeep these wonderful historic homes?
Well, you see that there's grey hairs. That's what goes into it. Grey hairs and then hair dye. I don't know. They're just trying to fall down all the time. I don't know what you think. They're just every day and every time when you think you've fixed and worked through the fix list, you turn around a corner and there's a new crack.
Even the most simple maintenance job becomes a huge thing when you're talking about a museum. The Parsonage is Grade 1 listed. And even a small job all the rooms got to be cleared. I've just been watching the series on iPlayer, the National Trust, which is quite interesting. Obviously, that's those are huge houses that they're looking at, but it's very, very expensive. That's the other thing. It's just an ongoing. We've always got a rolling program of work that we're aware of that needs doing. Things that need doing, that are really priority, things that we can leave for a few months, things that need doing within the next 5 years. So, we've always got a program of maintenance going on. And of course, that has a big impact on the collection, the museum collection itself. If your building is letting water in or there are problems with it, then that is going to affect, your fragile contents.
It's one of those things that's I find really fascinating about writers' houses is that in many ways, the building itself is an artifact. It's both the thing that contains the artifact and some ways the most important thing of all. So it's the roofs, it's the windows, it's keeping all of that. And then within that, things like light and damp, they're the worst things. So there's all called environmental monitoring and checking what the humidity is. And of course, if it gets too damp, then stuff comes to eat it. And it's a balance. It's a balance. And then also balancing, keeping down on those with being open enough to earn the income to pay to fix the roof tiles. So it is genuinely a pleasure, but it's a balance. And it's always, to quote an Austen phrase, it always comes down to pewter as well. It's always fine. So again, I know somebody who's bought some tiles. So thank you and I know there's audience for both of our houses that have supported our work. So, thank you so much for that. You are all a part of keeping these things going for the next generation. There's also more fun things like waxing the floors, which is one of my favorite things to do.
Yeah, you've got to be very hands-on, I think, as well. So I've known previous directors at the parsonage chasing sheep out of the garden. We've got all kinds of things to contend with. Yeah,
right. Yeah, hands-on is very true.
Thank you for answering that question, Deb. Susan, do you have any last questions, or should we wrap up?
There was just one I think is worth asking. It's not about the houses, but it's about the authors again, and so that they're both from ministers' families. That's always a question people find interesting.
Yeah.
They're very different ministers. And I think that needs to be considered. They're different ministers at different times, working within very different sections of the church. I very early have understood, so I will hand over to Anne talk about Mr. Bronte's, but Austen's father is at a time when it's a good profession to go into. He's a very dedicated vicar, but he's not part of the evangelical school. And Austen's family, her cousin Edward Cooper is an evangelical, but the Reverend George Austen, he's pre-evangelical, really, before it really starts kicking off. And that does, I believe, shape both their writings, the differences in their father's approach. And it is different. The Reverend George Austen is traditionally Church of England, in a way that Patrick Brontë is in a different position in the church.
Haworth, although Patrick Brontë was Church of England, there was a very strong, still is a very strong non-conforming tradition in Haworth. And the Brontë juvenilia, and even to some extent the novels, have got quite a lot of sort of ranting caricatures of ranting nonconformist preachers and Joseph in Wuthering Heights. Interestingly, Jane Eyre was described as an unchristian book by contemporary reviewers. And if you think about that novel, every figure, religious figure in that book is kind of shown to be deeply flawed in some way.
Austen's clerical figures are as well. Just
Yeah.
fascinating.
Not Henry, not Henry Tilney.
I think
we'll talk about that, Lizzie. Okay.
Brontë was a very eccentric, opinionated man.
And complex, wasn't he? It's really complicated.
Yeah, very. And I think he encouraged his children to sort of form their own opinions, which clearly they did.
They did. Yeah.
Okay, here's one final question. I guess that needs a short answer, but it's a big question, and it seems like it'll pull things together. How have you come to appreciate the Brontes and Jane Austen from working at their houses?
That's a very big question.
Well, I can say that I was a huge admirer of the Brontes when I started working at the parsonage back in the 19th century. It feels like sometimes. So yeah, I was a huge fan. I'd read all the novels, thought I knew a lot about them. But you do gain a huge amount of insight when you're actually working at the parsonage. And I think for me, one of the biggest discoveries was kind of realising what the Brontes were up against and realising how brave they were in their writing. When you read the contemporary reviews of their novels, you know, they caused a terrible amount of Wuthering Heights and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall were, you know, condemned as being brutal and coarse. And young ladies were advised not to read them. And I've kind of taken that on board without really thinking about what it meant. And the Brontes challenged so many different social conventions at the time. I think people kind of lose sight of that. And I think a lot of it is down to film adaptations, which tend to focus on the, you know, the romantic elements to their books. But these are actually, particularly Wuthering Heights and The Tenant, you know, they are really shockingly, gut-wrenchingly shocking books, really.
I completely agree, Anne. Actually, I like you. I loved Austen when I came into the house, but I think it's actually for different reasons. Actually, that bravery, and in a different way, Austen was living an unconventional life for her time period, and in many ways, she certainly didn't live the life she wrote for her heroines. And I think that's one of the things I've, you know, really come to understand, that actually. And for Austen, it partly comes to her early biography, the idea that this stuff just happens. And, you know, she just sits down and all this writing just comes out. And actually that sense of how a household was actually shaped around to support her, how hard she worked, and the determination. And I think that's what is really, there are so many differences, but one of those really lovely parallels between the sisters and Branwell and Austen is this absolute determination from a really young age of, this is what I want. At a time when I know there's everything, but there's literally conduct books. There are things that you are being sat down and Fordyce sermons to go, you should not do this. This is not how you are supposed to be. This is not how you're supposed to think. This is not how you're supposed to behave. This is not what you're supposed to do. And all these women incredibly go, no, I'm not going to do that. To quote Austen, I'm going to go my own way. And though I might fail in that, I know I'd never succeed in anything else. And that is actually incredible. And I think there's something about following in their footsteps and being in those domestic, because they are also another thing about the majority of writers, female writers, with the exception of Virginia Woolf, but she transgresses so many different things in a positive way. They have to write from the dining room. They don't have studies. They don't have this separate space. They are writing and they are centered from within the domestic, which is where they are told they should be. And yet these women are going, no, I'm going to go all these different places in my mind and I'm going to be something and I'm going to change the world. when you sit in the space where they're doing that and you see that they're confined and they're hemmed in and there's servants running back and forth and the doorbell's ringing, extraordinary.
I'm glad you brought up Fordyce, because he tells them specifically, your study should be not books, but men.
Yeah.
And you're right that they both are making their own way, or they all are making their own way. Thank you. This was wonderful.
That was great.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions, Eric?
Well, there are, but we just are out of time.
We are.
So, well, thank you so much, Anne and Lizzie. This was fabulous. And thank everybody in the audience. Obviously, we appreciate your being here. And a reminder about Jane Austen Co. going on a summer break. But we will be back in this fall, early September, I guess, right? Sometime in September.
Yeah.
And again, the topic will be Austen and the Brontes, because there's just so much more to say. And so you should get on the mailing list for Jane Austen Co., and then you'll get that information in your mailbox. So thank you, everyone.
And in the meantime, please consider donating when and if you can to help us bring this free programming to the world. Nadia is putting up a link to our donations page, and every little bit helps. We really appreciate the support. And I should say, not just the support of your donations, but also of your attendance and your participation. This series is really a joy for us all. So thank you.
Yeah. And so let's everyone give Anne and Lizzie a kind of a round of applause in the chat. Please send your thanks there. And a final reminder, the recording of thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Lizzie. And we hope to bring you back on for another episode in the future. That'd be wonderful.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Take care.